Hi, my name is Chris Dow, and I work for the Poor Handmaids of Jesus Christ as a special events coordinator, which is how I have come to know the people at Sojourner and work with them. So my story basically is telling my experience as a white person awakening to racism in the United States. I grew up on the south side of Chicago at 89th and Harper, which is one block west of Stony Island in the Calumet Heights neighborhood. We lived on the second floor of a traditional three-story brownstone apartment building. My dad owned a small meat market on 63rd and Blackstone in the Woodlawn neighborhood that also carried some groceries. It was a relatively short bus ride north on Stony Island from where we lived. When I was young, an older black gentleman named Ty worked in the shop, laying clean sawdust periodically, sweeping it up at night, and generally tidying up around the place. He was always very sweet to me when I visited the store with my mom or grandmother, and all the adults in the store, whether white or black, were familiar and friendly with one another. One day my grandmother told me Ty would be bringing something to the house for my father, and I was very excited and went to the window watching for him because I knew he would come the same way as my dad when he came home from work. After a while I saw him walking our way, and I waved and he waved back. He disappeared into the entrance to our building, the buzzer buzzed, and my grandmother opened the door and told me she would be back in a minute instead of buzzing him in. When she came back, she was alone and holding the package he'd brought. I asked her where he was and ran to the window where I saw him walking back towards the bus. I was crying and I asked my grandmother why Ty hadn't come upstairs to see me. She replied, "A colored man would never come into a white person's home. He knows his place." This was my first exposure to racism. Until that time, I did not see any difference in people. My friends on the block were Italian with thick dark hair or part Cuban with dark skin, as well as some blonde, blue-eyed, and freckled girls. I didn't see the difference as anything more other than what made Carol look like Carol and Patty look like Patty. I just saw them as my friends. I saw the adults in my dad's store as the people who shopped and worked there. They were all just people. While recognizing qualities that distinguish folks from one another, like, my dad wore glasses and my mom had dark hair, I didn't see any difference in us as people. I just didn't get the idea that black and white folks were somehow different from each other. So fast forward a few years, I'm in 4th grade and walking home from school at lunch with a girl who had just moved into the neighborhood and was in my grade at school. When I got home, I excitedly told my mom I had a new friend and she was colored. I thought that was cool. I asked my mom if I could invite her to come over and play, and my mom said no. She told me I wasn't allowed to ask colored kids to come over. It was okay to be with them in school, even to play with them at recess, but that was all. This made me really sad, and I didn't know how to process the feelings because I didn't think I could talk to anyone about it. So moving ahead a bit, not too far ahead though, suddenly we're buying a house in a neighborhood called Jeffrey Manor. I know now it was only about 2 miles away from the apartment we lived in, but in Chicago you can enter a different world simply by crossing the street. When we moved into the house on 96 in Euclid in January 1966, the neighborhood was entirely white. Then on April 4, 1968, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. The whole world changed. My dad didn't go to his shop during the riots. At the time I didn't understand much of what was happening, but it turned out the neighborhood was basically destroyed, and my dad had to close his store and walk away from it. Racism had touched me again. In my child's brain, my dad lost his livelihood because a hateful white person killed a peace-loving black minister, and I still see it that way. The effects of racism on all people are so far-reaching as to be almost impossible to enumerate. I started junior high in 1968, and in 8th grade, our homeroom and English teacher explained to us that the entire class had been split into 2 classrooms, homogeneously, according to our grades and test scores. We were in the smarter group, she told us, and so we had a great responsibility to be well-behaved, etc. She constantly reminded us that we were better than the other class. It was interesting that with the exception of 2 Hispanic kids and 1 Filipino girl, we were an all-white class. All the black kids were in the inferior class. But no, it had nothing to do with racism, not at all. It was all about the test scores and grades. But they didn't separate us on the playground at recess or at other times where we were waiting to enter school in the morning or whatever, so there was still some interaction between the two groups. When I think back, it reminds me of what my mom said to me about my colored friend in 4th grade, that it was okay to be friends on the playground and in the classroom, but not at home. Well, now someone had apparently decided it was not good to be together in the classroom either. When you type white flight into a search engine, Chicago is the first thing that comes up. During my years at Luella, and perhaps even before, families began moving out of our neighborhood. I remembered hearing my mom say the first family to move from our block did so in the middle of the night without telling anyone. By the time I started high school, only a handful of the kids I'd known in the lower grades were still living in the area, and many of those left during the summer after my freshman year in 1971. Again, I didn't really understand why people would move away just because a black family moved into the neighborhood. I saw no logic in that action and reaction. Property values, that's what my parents told me. Since my dad had lost his business and was getting day-by-day work through his union, they were in no position to move. So they stayed and even got to know their new neighbors. Surprisingly, my mother remarked to me several years later that her black neighbors were nicer than many of her white neighbors had been in the past. So I guess she learned something. In 2010, we had a reunion dinner with some of our 7th and 8th grade friends, including many of the kids whose families had moved away. The biggest topic of discussion was white flight. Those who had moved away remembered crying because they were forced to move away from their lifelong friends. One guy, my first boyfriend, got home from our graduation luncheon to find his parents waiting for him in their car behind a packed moving truck, and he'd not been told anything about it. Those of us who had been left behind remembered being puzzled and brokenhearted that so many of our friends had left, often without being able to say goodbye. When I think back to those days, I realize that for a time I resented the black families who moved into our neighborhood because their moving in meant that many of my friends left. At some point I realized that was backward thinking, as the homeowners were not forced to sell their homes. It was their choice to do so. And I still feel the guilt at ever having felt that way. My freshman year at Bowman High School in South Chicago included race riots. Right in the school, every day, in every hall, classroom, and washroom, in and around the cafeteria, on the grounds, and at the football games. It was just part of being at the school. I was scared and unhappy, and so my parents were able to transfer me to a different high school, the all-white high school on the southeast side, which is also known as White Island. I really didn't mean to promote racism. I was just scared. As a working person in the mid-'80s, part of my job was as a union steward for the union that I belonged to. And I was only called to represent a fellow employee in a disciplining situation a few times, and always for the same person. A young woman, a single black woman with a baby, was often late for work. The rules called for a meeting after 3 incidents of being late. Now, I worked in many departments for that company, and I saw people coming in late without so much as a glance, more times than I can say. It was typically tolerated. But this young woman's clerical co-workers were all married white women, and they would tell their supervisor whenever she came in late. The white male supervisor, though he seemed sympathetic, couldn't let the young woman off the hook without getting into trouble himself. Even then, I felt that her co-workers were out to get her. As the steward, my job was simply to be present during the discipline and ensure that the rules were followed. This haunts me because I'm a single mother myself, and for many years was late for work, often because mornings with small children are never simple, no matter what color you are. My supervisors and co-workers, whether white or black, were always understanding. Now I wish I had been strong enough to question why this young woman was being persecuted in this way. The sad thing is that I can't remember her name, and that really bothers me. Life isn't perfect, and neither are people. We just have to try our best. I'm fortunate enough to live in a pleasant neighborhood whose population is diverse. after the protests over the murder of George Floyd began, I ordered a Black Lives Matter sign for my front lawn where it's proudly displayed. My handyman, who is white, expressed concern about the sign. Aren't I afraid it might cause me to be the target of vandalism or even violence? I replied that if someone's reaction to the sign is violence, then that is a thing itself that I will report to the police, and it will become part of the narrative surrounding the racism white people have incited, tolerated, or ignored for many years. It's time to boldly show we will not be a part of the ignorance and hatred anymore. Silence is complicity. At last I feel I'm doing the right thing. I don't know what else I will do, but I don't plan to stop with just a sign on my lawn.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.